What was supposed to be a normal moment on camera suddenly turned into complete chaos. 1 second, everyone was filming. The next, there was screaming, shouting, accusations, and somehow, 2 people from the audience ended up rushing the stage. And then came the question that changed the entire mood of the room. Who sent them? Because according to what was being said after the incident, this wasn't just some random audience disturbance. There were claims that the people involved were connected to someone in the room, and suddenly, the focus shifted from the physical confrontation to something much deeper. Trust, loyalty, and whether somebody was lying. The tension was so intense that security immediately went into lockdown mode. People were being told to get into the dressing room. Doors were being secured. And the priority became protecting everyone, especially the children. But here's where this story gets even more complicated. Because underneath all of the screaming and accusations was a completely different story involving the children caught in the middle of adult drama. And that contrast is what makes this situation so emotional. Let's break down exactly what happened. The confrontation appears to have started almost instantly. There was shouting, and one person made it clear that they weren't going to tolerate disrespect. The message was simple. If you disrespect me, I'm going to disrespect you back. But before the situation could escalate even further, applause and commotion filled the room. People weren't sure what was happening. Then everything changed. Security stepped in and started giving instructions. Everyone needed to stay together. The dressing room had to be locked down. Nobody was supposed to enter. And most importantly, there was concern about the safety of the family members who were there. The atmosphere had completely changed from a television production into a security situation. One person was visibly concerned about making sure her daughter was okay. And that tells you just how serious the moment had become. This wasn't simply an argument anymore. There were people rushing the set, security trying to control the situation, and accusations flying around about who knew what and who may have been responsible. Then came one of the biggest accusations of the entire incident. The claim was essentially that this couldn't have happened randomly. Someone suggested that the people involved may have been connected to someone in the room. And that's when suspicion started spreading. Because if 2 audience members were able to get close enough to physically confront someone on stage, the obvious question was, how did they get there? Was it random? Was security caught off guard? Or did somebody know exactly where to go? Those questions remained unanswered in the immediate aftermath. But eventually, production was able to review what happened. And according to the discussion that followed, the 2 audience members were identified as people known to Yandy. That revelation completely changed the conversation. Because now it wasn't simply, who attacked Samantha? It became, who knew these people and why were they there? And this is where the confrontation between Samantha and Yandy became much more personal. But before that argument exploded, there was another moment that almost felt like a completely different world. The children, despite all of the adult conflict surrounding them, the kids still appeared to have a strong relationship with each other. And that's important, because while the adults were arguing, the children weren't carrying the same hostility. They talked about their brothers and sisters with genuine affection. They laughed. They talked about playing basketball. They described their favorite things about one another. There was a sweetness to the moment that stood in stark contrast to everything happening around them. One child talked about how much they loved their brothers. Another talked about playing basketball together. And when asked just how much they loved their siblings, the answer wasn't complicated. It was essentially, more than you can even measure. And that moment hit Yandy emotionally. Because whatever problems existed between the adults, the children didn't create those problems. They didn't choose the distance. They didn't choose the arguments. And they certainly didn't choose to be caught between people who couldn't get along. That is what made the situation so painful. Yandy acknowledged that the children had a very strong bond. And she expressed sadness that adult drama was preventing them from spending more time together. That statement sounds simple. But in the context of everything that had just happened, it carried a lot of weight. Because while everyone was fighting over what happened on stage, The bigger question was what all of this conflict was doing to the next generation. The children still loved one another. They still wanted to play together. They still looked at each other as brothers and sisters. But the adults around them were creating barriers. And then the conversation returned to the incident. Samantha wanted answers. She wanted to know exactly who had come out of the audience, who attacked her, who knew them, and most importantly, did Yandy know who they were? Yandy's response was that she didn't know. She said she hadn't actually seen what happened. And that's where the tension immediately returned. Because Samantha wasn't satisfied. From her perspective, somebody had physically touched her, and she wanted accountability. Then came the accusation that Yandy knew more than she was admitting. The room became tense again. Samantha essentially questioned how Yandy could sit there and claim not to know anything while people connected to her were allegedly involved. And that's when the discussion moved from the physical incident to the issue of honesty. Samantha accused Yandy of pretending not to know who was responsible. The argument became, do you really not know or are you refusing to say? And that distinction was everything. Because if Yandy genuinely didn't know, then the accusation was unfair. But if she did know and wasn't admitting it, then the entire situation looked completely different. And according to the confrontation, Samantha believed the second explanation. She argued that someone connected to Yandy must have known these people. And she demanded that Yandy own whatever role she may have played. But Yandy wasn't accepting that accusation. Her response was essentially, why would I need somebody to come and fight you? And that question cuts straight to the heart of the controversy. Because even if the people involved were known to Yandy, that doesn't automatically prove that she sent them. Knowing someone and sending someone are two completely different things. And that's where the accusations became dangerous. The evidence, the assumptions, and the emotions were all beginning to collide. The confrontation wasn't just about what happened. It was about what everyone believed happened. And those are two very different things. But there was still one major piece of the story that had not been fully resolved. If production really had identified the two audience members, then who were they? Why were they there? And did their connection to Yandy actually mean anything? Because that unanswered question was about to push the argument to another level. The moment production identified the two audience members, the entire situation took another turn. Until that point, there was uncertainty. People were asking questions. Nobody seemed completely sure about what had happened. But once the claim surfaced that the individuals were known to Yandy, suspicion became much more direct. And Samantha wasn't prepared to let it go. From her perspective, somebody had physically attacked her. She wanted to know who was responsible. And she wanted the people involved to be held accountable. But Yandy was maintaining that she didn't know who had done it. That answer wasn't convincing to Samantha. And the argument quickly became less about the attack itself and more about whether Yandy was being truthful. Samantha challenged her directly. The implication was clear. You know more than you're saying. And that accusation is what made the confrontation so explosive. Because once someone questions your honesty in front of everyone, you're no longer defending yourself against an incident. You're defending your character. Yandy pushed back. She rejected the idea that she had arranged for anyone to attack Samantha. And honestly, that distinction matters. There is a huge difference between someone being connected to you and someone acting on your instructions. Without direct evidence, those things cannot simply be treated as the same. But in a heated confrontation, logic often gets pushed aside by emotion. Everyone had just witnessed chaos. People were shaken. Security had been involved. The children were nearby, and emotions were already at their highest point. So every accusation sounded bigger than it might have under normal circumstances. Then another criticism emerged. Samantha questioned how Yandy could claim to care about the children while seemingly refusing to acknowledge what had happened to their mother. That accusation touched on something much deeper. Because both sides were talking about the children. Both sides claimed to care about them. But they were approaching the issue from completely different perspectives. Yandy was focusing on the children's relationship. She wanted people to remember that the kids loved each other despite the adult conflict. Samantha was focusing on accountability. Her position was essentially, you cannot talk about love and family while ignoring what happened to me. And that's why the argument became so emotionally complicated. Both sides were talking about family. They simply weren't defining the problem in the same way. One side was saying, look at what this adult conflict is doing to the children. The other was saying, you cannot use the children as a reason to avoid accountability. And somewhere between those two positions was the real tragedy. The children weren't responsible for any of it. They didn't create the tension. They didn't invite the confrontation. They didn't choose which adults would get along. Yet they were the ones potentially losing valuable relationships because of the conflict surrounding them. That's why the earlier scenes involving the children were so powerful. Their affection appeared genuine. They talked about their siblings naturally. They laughed. They played. They didn't seem interested in carrying the grudges of the adults around them. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Why should children have to inherit conflicts they never created? That's ultimately what makes the situation bigger than one argument or one stage incident. It's about what happens when adult disagreements become so intense that they begin affecting family relationships. At the same time, the attack itself still needed an explanation. If the audience members really were known to Yandy, that fact deserved to be investigated. But knowing someone isn't proof of conspiracy. And that's an important distinction when looking at dramatic situations like this. The strongest claims require evidence. Otherwise, suspicion can quickly become treated as fact. And that's exactly what appeared to be happening during this confrontation. One accusation led to another. One person questioned the other person's honesty. The other person denied involvement. And the more they argued, the harder it became to separate what was actually known from what people believed. That's why the phrase "own it" became so significant. Samantha wanted Yandy to acknowledge responsibility for something she believed Yandy knew about. Yandy, however, wasn't accepting that responsibility. She essentially asked, "Why would I need anyone to fight you?" And that response exposed the fundamental disagreement. Samantha believed there was enough circumstantial evidence to question Yandy. Yandy believed the accusation itself was unreasonable. Neither side seemed willing to move. And once neither side moves, a confrontation like this can go in only one direction: further escalation. But perhaps the most revealing part of the entire situation wasn't the shouting. It was the contrast between the adults and the children. The adults were divided. The children were connected. The adults were arguing over loyalty. The children were talking about love. The adults were asking who was responsible. The children were talking about basketball and spending time together. That contrast tells you everything. Sometimes children can maintain relationships that adults make incredibly complicated. And that's why the conversation about the kids shouldn't be dismissed as just another emotional moment on television. It was actually the central issue, because no matter who was right about the confrontation, the children were still caught in the consequences. And if the adults cannot resolve their differences, the children may continue to lose opportunities to grow up together. That's the part that deserves the most attention. As for the stage incident, there are still questions that should not be answered through speculation alone. Who exactly were the two people? What motivated them? How did they get close enough to the stage? Did anyone encourage them? Or was this simply an unpredictable audience incident that spiraled out of control? Those are separate questions. And until there is clear evidence, they should remain questions, not conclusions. But one thing is undeniable. The incident exposed just how fragile the relationships had become. It showed how quickly a tense environment can turn into chaos. It showed why security had to intervene. And it showed that once trust disappears, even a simple statement can become another source of conflict. The biggest lesson here may not be about who won the argument. There really wasn't a winner. Someone was physically confronted. Security had to lock things down. People were left questioning each other's intentions. and children were reminded of how much adult conflict can affect their lives. The real victory would be finding a way for the adults to separate their personal disagreements from the children's relationships. Because the kids already made their feelings clear. They love their brothers and sisters. They want to spend time together. They want to play. They want to laugh. They don't care about the accusations adults are making. And perhaps that's exactly what everyone needs to remember. The children didn't ask for the drama. They didn't create the tension. And they shouldn't have to pay the price for it. So while the question of who knew whom and who knew what may continue to fuel debate, the bigger story is much simpler. A moment of chaos exposed years of tension. A confrontation turned into accusations. And behind all of it were children who still seemed capable of loving each other without carrying the grudges of the adults. That may be the most important part of the entire story. Because at the end of the day, the adults can argue about what happened. They can question each other's motives. They can defend themselves. They can demand answers. But the children have already given their answer. They still love each other. And maybe that's the one thing this entire situation shouldn't be allowed to destroy.